Philosopher and psychiatrist Mohammed Rashed describes the following psychiatric case. Abayo was a 29-year-old woman, originally from West Africa, who had lived in the UK with her father for the past 15 years. She had always been religious and attended a Pentecostal church in London, which her father also attended. Several months prior to her admission to a mental health unit, she became disillusioned with her usual church, describing the sermons as empty and uninspiring. Instead of attending that church, she made contact with the church in her birth country, which emphasised personal experience of God. She stopped going to work, instead going for long walks and spending hours reading the Bible and listening to sermons. 2 months prior to admission, she began isolating herself from her friends and reported having intense experiences which involved seeming to hear God talk to her. At times she would feel that the Holy Spirit was taking over her body. Her father became worried and appealed to the pastor in the London church, who made it clear that he regarded the practices as harmful and excessive and did not endorse them as part of their religious tradition. A few days prior to admission, she began to fast for prolonged periods in order to further cleanse her soul. The fasting challenged her physically, and she was found confused and disorientated in a public place. An ambulance was called and she was referred to the mental health services. Once admitted, Abayo told the psychiatrist and social worker that she had no doubt that she had been in direct communication with God. She felt she had come to understand what God was and that she was onto something significant in her life. She was sectioned under the Mental Health Act on the ground that she was presenting with second-person hallucinations, hearing the voice of God, and command hallucinations, volitional passivity, and was a significant risk to herself due to social and occupational deterioration and fasting. A further reason for the decision to section her was that her father and the London church pastor did not endorse the idea that her experiences came from God. Abayo resisted treatment and regarded her incarceration as a test from God. A week after admission, she was diagnosed as having an acute psychotic episode. Treatment was then forced on her. After a couple of days of treatment, she accepted medication. 2 weeks after that, she acknowledged that she might have been ill and no longer reported hearing the voice of God. However, the case does not have an entirely happy ending. By the end of her treatment, she no longer felt the expectancy of a major change in her life and was transformed into an unmotivated and indifferent young woman. Medical professionals face a problem when responding to cases like Abayo's. If they diagnose someone with an illness and treat them for it, then it is possible that the meaning-making aspects of the experience may be lost. The person may well cease to have experiences such as voice hearing that they regard as significant, and the effect of being told that their experience is the result of an illness may also diminish their belief that their experience has any spiritual meaning. If, on the other hand, the person is not diagnosed and treated, the dysfunctional elements of their condition may significantly worsen, and a severe condition develop that is far more difficult to treat at a later stage. Abayo's case highlights this conundrum, since it is clear that she accorded meaning and significance to her life before treatment. Yet it is also clear that her condition included dysfunctional or pathological elements, such as being confused, disorientated, physically challenged, and isolated, that were sufficiently severe for an ambulance to be called and for her to be considered a risk to herself. An apparently similar problem can be faced by clergy and other people with pastoral roles in churches and other religious communities. In these contexts, someone may be struck by the similarities between Abayo and certain saints and wonder whether they should encourage the person to trust the experience or to seek the help of a doctor. The first problem, the problem for medical professionals, has given rise to studies in which psychiatrists and psychologists seek to provide criteria differentiating mental illness from religious experience. These studies tend to assume that someone who has an experience, such as Abayo's, could only be having either an instance of mental illness or else a religious or spiritual experience. Here, I'm interested in exploring the possibility that someone might be experiencing both a religious experience and also a mental illness. Why might a both-and view be plausible and worth considering? There may be practical, clinical and pastoral benefits to considering such a view. If a both-and view is correct, then it may be that in cases like ABO's, both diagnosis and treatment on the one hand and spiritual encouragement and guidance on the other are appropriate. In other words, it's at least possible that if ABO's religious and medical context had not presupposed that something could be only either an illness or a religious experience, then the end result might have been quite different. We do not know for sure, of course, but it's at least possible that combining treatment with spiritual guidance and encouragement could have left ABO without the dysfunctional aspects of her experience, but with the sense that God was communicating her through the experience and that her life did indeed have meaning and significance, a belief that the Christian tradition would endorse. In addition to practical motivations, there are also theological reasons for considering such a view. A significant strand of the Christian tradition holds that grace perfects nature, rather than the two being opposed. In other words, according to this view, divine action in the world takes place within and builds on natural phenomena, including human psychology. Consequently, much Christian theology will favour conjunctive causal explanations, which posit the presence of both divine and natural causes. Thus, for example, discussing whether Julian of Norwich's vision should be regarded as an illness-induced hallucination or as from God, theologian and philosopher Grace Jansen notes that it would be a mistake to attribute to God only that for which no causal explanation is yet available. The emphasis on the idea that God works in and through natural phenomena naturally makes many Christians theologians sympathetic to the possibility of a both-and account in the context of psychopathology or mental illness, as in other contexts. In order to consider the possibility of a both-and view, I will consider the plausibility of 4 models, all of which are possible versions of a both-and view. Model 1 is the Mysterium tremendum view, according to which an encounter with the divine might be so awful, in the literal sense of that term, so full of awe, awesome I suppose, that it results in mental illness. On this view, encountering God is psychologically dangerous. Someone like ABO may be having a genuine religious experience that is sufficiently disruptive that they experience mental disorder and mental illness as a result of that experience of God. Model 2 is the identity view, according to which mental illness and religious experience are ways of describing the same thing from different perspectives. On this account, something that is caused by God is also, from a human perspective, disordered. Model 3 is the mental openness view, according to which at least some people who are susceptible to psychological instability and mental disorder are also more able to apprehend communication from God and potentially other non-physical beings. On this view, the psychological trait of mental openness gives rise to the possibility and even likelihood of both mental illness and also religious experience. Finally, Model 4 is the honeysuckle on a broken fence view, according to which someone might encounter mental illness for natural biopsychosocial reasons, and God might use this to draw the person closer to God's self. I call this the honeysuckle on a broken fence view because the image I want to conjure up is of something beautiful and good, the person drawing closer to God, being somehow supported or at one level of causation coming about as a result of something dysfunctional and undesirable, such as a broken fence or an instance of mental illness. Model 4 is the opposite of Model 1 in terms of causal direction. For Model 1, a genuine religious experience can result in a mental illness. For Model 4, a mental illness can become an occasion for a genuine religious experience. Model 2 and Model 3 both posit that mental disorder and religious experience have a shared cause. According to Model 2, this is just because mental illness and religious experience are identical and so must share the same causes because they're the same thing. According to Model 3, it's because something that gives rise to one, namely mental openness, may, at a different moment or even at the same moment, also give rise to the other. I'm going to argue that Models 1 and 2 should be rejected, and that while the possibility of Model 3 shouldn't be rejected altogether, at the moment I think there is an absence of evidence for it. However, I will argue that there are good reasons to affirm Model 4. In order to evaluate these four models, I will use a combination of psychological, psychiatric, philosophical, and in particular, Christian theological criteria. Concomitantly with this Christian theological approach, I will use the term religious experience in a realist sense to mean an experience that comes from God, and not merely in a constructivist sense as a cultural way of making sense of an experience that does not point to anything outside the world. If something is a religious experience on this understanding, then it is an instance of special divine action. In other words, something is a religious experience if it comes from God, not only in the sense that everything comes from God by virtue of God creating and holding all things in being, sometimes called general divine action, but also in the sense of God acting in particular ways in creation, for example through miracles and providence and grace. So, Model 1, the Mysterium tremendum view. The term Mysterium tremendum means fearful mystery and denotes the idea that experiencing God can include not only fascination and wonder, a mysterium fascinans, but also experiencing a terrifying, overwhelming power. This in particular was Rudolf Otto's thought. In the background of this idea is the thought that there is something dangerous from a human perspective about encountering God. It carries something of the idea, sometimes expressed in the Hebrew Bible, that a person cannot see the face of God and live. In the context of this paper, the Mysterium tremendum view posits more specifically that an encounter with God might be so awful that it disorders the recipient's mind. One objection to this Mysterium tremendum view can be drawn from a meta-study by Alexander Moreira Almeida and Adair de Menezes Jr. These are two Brazilian psychiatrists who've written on this. This meta-study points to a significant consensus among psychiatrists and psychologists that salutary religious experience, healthy religious experience, can be clearly distinguished from psychopathology or mental illness using various criteria. Unlike mental illness, they argue, salutary religious experience is characterised by various features, including an absence of suffering and functional impairment over time, that the experience promotes personal growth over time, and that the experience is other-directed rather than egocentric and does not result in the person becoming isolated. So they've got this list of criteria by which people can clearly distinguish mental illness from religious experience, healthy religious experience. Menezes and Moreira Almeida indicate that psychotic disorders and non-psychopathological religious experience seem to have different characteristics. For this reason, they cannot be identical. On this view, far from an encounter with God causing psychological problems, genuine religious experience would be distinguished from psychopathology by increased human flourishing, such as growth over time and other-directedness, and would not be characterised by a decline in aspects of flourishing typical of mental illness, such as suffering and social and occupational dysfunction. A potential objection to this line of argument is that some of these criteria seem to assume just what the Mysterium tremendum view denies, that genuine religious experience is good for the person in ways that significantly align with secular understandings of human well-being, that it will be characterised by an absence of suffering and by being non-invasive, not disrupting the person's relationships and normal activities. Even if we take into account the ways in which Menezes and Moreira Almeida qualify the distinctive characteristics by appealing to the question of whether the phenomenon causes suffering over time, these criteria may seem at odds with significant hagiographical narratives within the Christian tradition. For example, many Christian saints' experiences of God seem to have involved longer-term suffering and been invasive, causing serious disruption in the person's personal and occupational life. St. Paul the Apostle's conversion experience led him to give up his social status and stable life in order to face instability, persecution, and ultimately martyrdom. So that's quite a significant disruption. St. Francis of Assisi's vision led him to sell his family wealth, renounce his parents, and give up his career to care for the poor and for lepers. The Gospels set up the expectation that in following Jesus, Christians may have to leave their families and face persecution. Far from the absence of suffering being a marker of genuine religious experience, in the Christian tradition, the converse is often the case. Given this, perhaps we might think that the Mysterium tremendum view is correct in suggesting that encountering God, including hearing God's voice, can indeed be dangerous and compromise a person's mental equilibrium and lead to ongoing instability and suffering. To overlook this fact, it could be argued, would be to flatten some of the more distinctive and challenging aspects of the Christian tradition. This may call into question criteria such as suffering and non-invasiveness, two of Moreira Almeida and Menezes' distinguishing criteria for which there is most support in the psychiatric and psychological literature. However, I want to defend Moreira Almeida and Menezes' distinguishing criteria from this objection to some extent, on the basis that the Christian tradition is not undiscerning about the kinds of challenges a Christian might face, or why they might face them. Saints may undergo suffering for the sake of the gospel, for example because they face persecution and martyrdom on account of their faith, or because they give up their worldly goods in order to devote their lives wholly to the poor. They may experience significant mental distress in the context of contemplative prayer and the associated breakdown of images of self and of God in order to become closer to God. And I'm thinking particularly of the Dark Knight tradition and the ideas that you find in St. John of the Cross and Thomas Merton here. However, they do not undergo suffering pointlessly, or if they do, for example, if they happen to be unlucky enough to suffer significant illness, this is not because they are Christians, but just because they are human, and then their saintliness may lie rather in the way they respond to it, rather than in the fact that they have it in the first place. So St. Therese of Lisieux or St. Alfonso would be examples of saints for whom that seems to be the case. To assert that God would communicate in such a way as to cause someone schizophrenia seems to be inattentive to the way saints suffered and the reasons they suffered. Perhaps we might modify Menezes and Moreira Almeida's first criterion then, and say that in order to be considered non-pathological, the religiously inflected experience should not involve suffering over time that does not further the person's spiritual life, where that includes the interpersonal aspect of their spiritual life. For example, their mission to care for the poor and the sick. In addition, we should keep in mind that the criteria are to be taken collectively. One criterion alone is not a necessary and sufficient condition for something being either psychopathological or a religious experience. While there is scope for nuancing some of Menezes and Moreira Almeida's criteria then, and while they need to be taken in conjunction with other criteria, we should not, I suggest, take these criteria off the table completely when we come to consider whether something is psychopathological or might instead be a genuine religious experience. Moreira Almeida and Menezes' study speaks against the Mysterium tremendum view because it indicates that people experiencing psychopathology or mental illness on the one hand and people encountering God on the other will typically have very different qualities to their experience. This does not seem like conclusive proof against the Mysterium tremendum view, since there clearly are still cases like Abbayo's who constitute sufficiently complex cases to faze psychiatrists. Nevertheless, these do seem to be the exception rather than the rule. This conclusion is supported by some theological criteria for discerning when a religious experience is genuine, which centres around what the fruits of the experience are, and whether they are characterised by love, hope and joy on the one hand, or dysfunction and suffering on the other. For example, one spiritual director at a Christian Ignatian retreat centre I spoke to says that an apparent religious experience needs to be tested in terms of its context and its fruits. Does it lead to greater holiness, increases of faith, hope and love? How grounded is this person in the rest of their life? Can they love well and work well? And importantly, is there a practical love of neighbour? The psychological and psychiatric criteria discussed above point to the ways in which clinicians can distinguish mental illness from healthy or salutary religious experience. The Ignatian criteria supplement and partially complement this by pointing to the relationship between an experience being salutary in particular ways and it being genuine. The psychiatric and psychological criteria on the one hand and the theological criteria agree against Model 1 that psychopathology such as that experienced by Abeo is not a sign of God directly working in the person's life. So Model 2, the identity view. While Model 1 suggests that an encounter with God causes or can cause mental disorder, Model 2 suggests that an encounter with God just is the mental disorder. The two are identical. In the case of Abeo, hearing God's voice would be an encounter with God and pathological psychosis. Fasting and becoming physically challenged would be obeying God's will and a diagnosable absence of self-care. Being confused and disorientated would reflect closeness to God, while being properly regarded by medical professionals, qua medical professionals, as a cause of concern. In order to get a handle on the identity view, we might bring to mind Ludwig Wittgenstein's duck rabbit. The duck rabbit can be seen as a duck, or it can be seen as a rabbit, and neither is more correct than the other. Can't be seen as both at the same time either. Likewise, on an identity view, an experience such as Abeo's may be seen either as a psychiatric disorder or else as an experience of God. Neither is wrong and neither is more correct than the other. In the context of discussing whether Mother Teresa's experience of mental distress could have been both a dark night of the soul and also psychiatric depression, psychiatrist S. Taylor Williams seems to be putting forward an identity kind of both and view when she says, there are many paradigms through which the human condition can be viewed. The Catholic Church's theology and the DSM's medical model are but two. No paradigm is necessarily objectively preferable to another. Model 2 is subject to the same criticisms as Model 1. If the identity view obtained, we should not expect to be able to distinguish between psychopathological psychosis and religious experience in the majority of cases. Furthermore, much if not most of the Christian tradition posits a close relationship between an experience being salutary or healthy and it being genuine, as the example of the Ignatian Retreat Centre director indicates. St. Teresa of Avila and others talk about how the fruits of an experience can tell us where the experience came from. If the experience does not result in a lasting sense of joy and peace, she says, then it cannot be from God. St. Teresa is not unusual in this respect. Similar ideas are found across the Christian tradition, from the Catholic, Ignatian and Carmelite traditions to charismatic and Pentecostal churches, and Tanya Lerman's work on the latter is very helpful in this regard. In these traditions and communities, the salutariness of an experience, characterised in terms of its peace and joy, is a necessary condition of the experience having come from God. And while spiritual and secular values do not always align, a lasting sense of peace and joy are likely to be considered goods by medical as well as religious communities. Model 2 therefore seems implausible. Williams states that no paradigm is objectively preferable to another. In this, I think she is reflecting a constructivist understanding of religious experience and also of mental illness. Indeed, I think it would be impossible or very difficult coherently to hold an identity view unless one has a constructivist understanding of these and related concepts. This reflects a further problem with an identity view from a theological perspective. The problem is that if religious experience is merely a cultural way of making sense of an experience that does not point to anything outside of the world, as a constructivist holds, then the reality of divine grace is denied. It can no longer be said that God works through human prayer, for example, to bring about the person's spiritual growth, but just that the person and their community make sense of certain experiences, such as change following prayer, by speaking of divine grace. This is an unacceptable conclusion from a Christian theological perspective. So model 3, the mental openness view. William James, the grandfather of current philosophical debates about psychopathology and religious experience, seems to me to suggest a mental openness account in his Varieties of Religious Experience. James recounts the case of George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, who, visiting Lichfield, hears the word of the Lord telling him to cry out in the streets, "Woe to the bloody city of Lichfield!" and apologies to anyone from Lichfield. At the same time, it seemed to Fox as though there were channels of blood running down the street in Lichfield, and the marketplace was a pool of blood. Following this episode, Fox learned of the martyrdoms that took place in Lichfield following the Diocletian persecution, and interpreted what he saw and heard as referring to these. William James seeks to find a middle ground between writing Fox off merely as psychopathological and simply dismissing the obvious parallels to aspects of mental illness such as hallucination. In order to do this, James suggests that Fox was both a great spiritual figure, where this includes genuine religious and spiritual insight, and also that he was psychopathological. He says, "No one can pretend for a moment that in point of spiritual sagacity and capacity, Fox's mind was unsound. Yet from the point of view of his nervous constitution, Fox was a psychopath or detrache of the deepest dye." This theme that great spiritual figures are particularly prone to the mental instability that we find in psychopathology is something that we find throughout James's book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. For example, later on James writes, "The whole array of Christian saints and heresiarchs, including the greatest, had their visions, voices, rapt conditions, guiding impressions and openings. They had these things because they had exalted sensibility, and to such things persons of exalted sensibility are liable." To be a great spiritual figure then, according to James, involves, or at least usually involves, having a certain kind of sensibility that gives rise to mental instability, including the mental instability we find in mental illness. Furthermore, great spiritual figures may themselves be psychopathological or have mental illness. But this fact does not detract from the fact that they are great spiritual figures, where this includes having genuine religious experiences and spiritual insight. James finds support for his view in the contemporary literature on the relationship between genius and psychopathology, according to which, as a general rule, the greater the genius, the greater the unsoundness. James extends this thought to include the idea of the mad religious genius. While it is tempting to regard mental instability as a sign that the person's religious experience is not genuine, James argues instead that the key factor in whether someone is a religious genius, that is, someone who has genuine religious experience and insight, lies in the theology their experience gives rise to. For example, of St. Teresa of Avila, whom I mentioned earlier, he writes, "Immediate luminousness, in short, philosophical reasonableness, and moral helpfulness are the only available criteria. St. Teresa might have had the nervous system of the placidest cow, and it would not now save her theology if the trial of that theology by these other tests should show it to be contemptible. And conversely, if her theology can stand these other tests, it would make no difference how hysterical or nervously off-balance St. Teresa may have been when she was with us here below." What should we make of the mental openness view? One criticism of it is that, if it were true, we would expect there to be evidence for it, but there is, I suggest, less evidence for it than we might think from reading James. In particular, I suggest, certain famous figures in the Christian tradition have become associated with hallucination-like experiences, for example, having sensory visions and voice hearing, where this association is, in fact, unwarranted. This is due in part to a hasty and ahistorical reading of historical texts. I will take as my example here the just mentioned case of St. Teresa of Avila, though I think it highly likely that other historical figures, such as perhaps George Fox or Julian of Norwich, have also been misread and misrepresented in this way. When we come to read St. Teresa, it turns out that she is clear that the experiences of visions and voices she describes are not sensory. She does not hear voices auditorially or see visions in a corporeal way. In relation to vision, she explicitly says, "The words are very explicit, but are not heard with the bodily ears." In relation to her vision, she says, "I never saw this vision or any other with my bodily eyes." In other words, St. Teresa distinguishes her visions and locutions, that is, the voices she hears, from those we would now regard as hallucinatory or hallucination-like, since, she emphasises, they are not experienced as though they are sensory. For modern readers, this raises the obvious question, what does she mean by voices and visions, if she does not mean the hallucinatory or hallucination-like experiences associated with psychosis and psychopathology? To understand why St. Teresa uses to us misleading terms like voices and visions, we need to go back to Augustine of Hippo, whose taxonomy of visions influenced how later people, including St. Teresa, used the language of visions and also voices. Of seeing visions, St. Augustine says, "One way is through the eyes by which the letters are seen. The second is through the human spirit, by which we think about our neighbour even when absent. The third is through a mental gaze by means of which love is beheld in an intellectual way." Visions, then, might be corporeal or experienced in a sensory way, or else they might be spiritual, in today's language imaginative in the sense of involving mental images, or again they might be intellectual, in our language conceptual. Each of these kinds of vision might be caused by God, they might be in old language supernatural, or else they might come from our minds. For example, a natural spiritual vision might be one in which someone imagines, perhaps for devotional purposes, being visible, being present at the crucifixion, including the sights and sounds that would include. A supernatural spiritual vision, on the other hand, is one in which this image is given in the person's mind by God rather than produced by the person's imagination. The experiences St. Teresa describes are thought to be supernatural because they come from God, but they are not corporeal, they are spiritual and intellectual in their form. In addition, Teresa is cautious of corporeal visions and locutions and suspicious of reports of them. For instance, in her autobiographical book, Her Life, in addition to emphasising that she did not herself experience corporeal locutions and visions, Teresa advises caution when people claim to have corporeal locutions, since she thinks people who want to claim falsely to themselves and to others to have had divine communications will claim this kind of locution. In The Interior Castle, another book by Teresa, Teresa raises the possibility that a locution could be illusory and that the illusion may be connected to what we would now call mental illness. She writes, "Sometimes and often the locution can be an illusion, especially with persons with a weak imagination or in those who are melancholic. I mean, those who suffer noticeably from melancholy." And melancholy is an old word for what we would now call mental illness. Teresa advocates a compassionate approach to people who suffer from melancholy and claim to have supernatural locutions. The spiritual advisor should not do anything that is distressing or disturbing to a soul, because truly the soul can't help it if these locutions come. This compassionate approach includes not putting too much emphasis on the experiences or making a big deal about them. In one intriguing and important passage, Teresa writes, "In my opinion, no attention should be paid to these persons who claim corporeal locutions, even if they say they see and hear and understand. But neither should one disturb these persons by telling them that their locutions come from the devil, one must listen to them as sick persons. The prioress or confessor to whom they relate their locutions should tell them to pay no attention to such experiences, that these locutions are not essential to the service of God, and that the devil has deceived many by such means, even though this particular person perhaps may not be suffering such deception. This counsel should be given so as not to aggravate the melancholy, for if they tell her the locution is due to melancholy, there will be no end of the matter. She will swear that she sees and hears, for it seems to her that she does. Even if the locutions are in fact from God, this cautious approach is to be preferred according to St. Teresa, since a person grows even when tested. Therefore, whether they are from God or not, it is best to put little emphasis on extraordinary experiences, such as corporeal locutions. This is partly because extraordinary experiences, such as corporeal locutions and visions, can be an aspect of mental illness, and partly because they can result from pride, which is deleterious to the spiritual life. In this section, I've tried to show that the idea that the Christian tradition is full of mad religious geniuses who have dramatic, hallucination-like visions and who hear voices gets supported by a misreading of some historical texts, taking as my case study the case of St. Teresa of Avila. Showing this in relation to other important spiritual figures is beyond the scope of this talk, but I think there's at least some evidence that a similar case could be made in relation to quite a few other figures, and Christopher Cook's work on this is very good. What I hope I have shown is that the evidence base for the mental openness view is not as solid as William James and others think. This does not mean it should be rejected as a possibility, but rather that there's just not enough evidence yet to affirm it. So finally, Model 4, the honeysuckle on a broken fence view. According to the honeysuckle on a broken fence view, an experience of mental illness could give rise to a genuine religious experience, even if the religiously inflected aspects of the experience, such as a religiously inflected hallucination, are not themselves genuine religious experiences. This has at least some support in psychology, in that according to post-traumatic growth literature, there is some reason to think that brokenness itself can constitute fertile ground for personal, including spiritual growth. Thus, for example, psychologists Tasia and Calhoun evaluate whether and to what extent someone has undergone growth after trauma on the basis of 5 criteria: their appreciation of life, relationship with others, new possibility in life, personal strength, and importantly for this discussion, spiritual change. Experience of severe mental illness involving psychosis is a significant cause of trauma, and preliminary studies suggest that people who have experienced severe mental illness involving psychosis can experience post-traumatic growth, and that post-traumatic growth is mediated in part by meaning-making. The psychological literature on post-traumatic growth therefore indicates that spiritual change is possible as a result of severe mental illness, including psychosis. However, it does not tell us whether a person's religious experience is genuine, something beyond the remit of psychology, but only whether it is spiritually salutary. We need to turn to theology to consider whether such an experience might also be genuine. While Model 1 and Model 2 rely on the theologically problematic idea that either suffering is good or else that God creates or causes evil, Model 4 appeals to the idea that God brings good out of evil, which is central to the Christian tradition. For example, the ancient Christian theme of Felix Culpa holds that sin is both an evil in itself and also something through which God works in order to bring about an even greater good, namely the incarnation. Rather than conflating good and evil, this motif shows that God is ultimately victorious over evil, and that God also uses evil precisely to bring this victory about. Another example of this is Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. The crucifixion is rightly regarded as an evil, the torture and execution of a human being which furthermore was the result of political expediency and concerned to preserve the status of the powerful. In short, as a result of human sin. The resurrection both brings about and also shows us God's victory over the forces of evil. As the theologian Edward Schillebeeckx puts it, human beings, not God, prepared the cross for Jesus, though God did not allow himself to be checkmated by this. Evil then remains evil, but according to the Christian tradition, God uses it to bring about a greater good. Proponents of Model 4 would regard psychopathology, mental illness, something that involves suffering and dysfunction, as an evil, rather than something caused or created by God. Nevertheless, they might think that God can bring something good out of it. Indeed, drawing on post-traumatic growth literature, they may think that there is something about brokenness itself that is particularly conducive to spiritual growth, and which includes genuine experience of God. This analysis suggests that there are perhaps mild psychological reasons and significant theological reasons for preferring Model 4, the honeysuckle on a broken fence view. In so doing, it affirms one version of a both-and account of psychopathology and religious experience. The narrative Model 4 suggests for cases like Abeo's is that a period of mental disorder involving psychosis should probably not be understood as resulting from an extraordinary encounter with God. However, it might be that Abeo's experience of illness could go on to bring her closer to God, and thus may become part of a genuine religious experience. Abeo believed that her religious experience lay in genuinely hearing the voice of God, and it is tempting to make this the focus of discussions about this topic. However, according to Model 4, Abeo may have been mistaken about this, though she wasn't mistaken about the fact that God was indeed communicating with her. In conclusion, I've argued that a both-and account is plausible, and that there is reason to prefer Model 4 in particular, and to reject Models 1 and 2. In so doing, I have affirmed a both-and approach to psychopathology and religious experience, but quite a cautious and understated one. I have argued against the idea that psychopathology is an offshoot of, identical with, or a side effect of genuine religious experience, and argued only that a person can come to know and experience God through the experience of mental illness or psychopathology. This, I suggest, is not because there is anything especially religiously significant about mental illness, but is just because God communicates through human experiences, including human experiences of suffering. From a pastoral perspective, my argument suggests that while we might initially think the religiously significant aspect of a person like Abeo's experience lies in the voices they report hearing, in fact it may lie in less striking aspects of their experience, such as their sense that their life, perhaps in spite of not being conventionally successful, has meaning and significance in the eyes of God. From a clinical perspective, my argument suggests that psychiatrists need not always choose between something being a mental illness or a religious experience. Both may be the case. As a result, both medication and also spiritual guidance by someone with a pastoral role may be appropriate. To this, it might be pointed out that some people might not want medication because they fear they would lose experiences they regard as highly religiously significant. And I've come across instances of this in cases such as mental illness involving psychosis, but also heard about them in relation to temporal lobe epilepsy, that people might not take certain medications because they worry about losing religiously significant experiences. It is a matter of practical wisdom to know when medicalising someone involuntarily is necessary, given that submitting someone to something involuntarily can itself be injurious. While the question of involuntary treatment lies outside the scope of this paper, 2 points are worth noting which might incline a patient to accept voluntary treatment. First, the person would still have the memory of those experiences. If those experiences were genuinely from God, they would, according to the tradition that I have been considering, continue to bear fruit if reflected upon with humility and spiritual wisdom. Second, while the dilemma is not one that St. Teresa, who lived before the existence of antipsychotic medications, considers, she strongly counselled against people relying too heavily on extraordinary experiences, whether or not these are from God, at the expense of cultivating more ordinary, deeply valuable spiritual virtues and practices. Medical treatment, then, may, on this view, help people to discern whether their experiences are indeed from God, reap the spiritual benefits from them, and provide them with the space to cultivate the virtues and practices that are at least equally part of the spiritual life.